Good day. I'm Marjorie Kaplan, Associate Director of Rutgers Climate Institute, and together with my colleague, Jean Herb of the Rutgers Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, we co-facilitate the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance. On behalf of the Alliance's co-chairs, Martha Maxwell Doyle of the Barnegat Bay Partnership and Gary Sondermeyer of Bayshore Recycling, I'd like to welcome you to today's conversation with Lisa Jackson on the business of climate change. For those of you who don't know us, our Alliance is a statewide network of diverse organizations who for the past 10 years have committed to advancing evidence-based nonpartisan climate change strategies at the state and local levels in New Jersey. We work within and across sectors, and we've produced more than 50 reports on topics ranging from what people, places, and assets are most vulnerable to climate change and why, to identification of policy options, best practices, and climate projections for New Jersey. For example, this alliance commissioned the first Science and Technical Advisory panel report on sea level rise for New Jersey, resulting in a 2016 report that was updated in 2019 and has been embraced by state government for planning and regulatory purposes. We provide accessible communication materials and convenings like today's, and we've spearheaded the development of decision support tools for New Jersey. I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's event, including the Energy Foundation, PSEG, Bayshore Recycling, NJM Insurance Group, the New Jersey Clean Energy Program, Mazer Consulting, soon to be known as Collier's Engineering and Design, and the New Jersey Conservation Foundation for their support. I'd like to also thank Matt Drews, who is part of the Rutgers team helping with today's event. Today's event is part of a series we began in the fall as a virtual alternative to our annual conference around the theme of New Jersey leading the way on climate change solutions. The prior sessions from September and October, as well as last week's discussion featuring Governor Murphy and Acting DEP Commissioner La Tourette, are recorded and available on our website, which you can see a link to, hopefully, in the chat box. Speaking of the chat box, we welcome your comments today to help inform our work going forward, so please feel free to comment in the chat. Today's event will be recorded as well and available on our website. Our theme for this series, New Jersey leading the way on climate change, could not be more apt when it comes to Lisa Jackson. As many of you may know, Lisa furthered New Jersey's leadership on climate during her tenure as Commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, where she also held positions as Assistant Commissioner for Enforcement, as well as Assistant Commissioner for Land Use Management. This followed nearly 20 years in the career ranks of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And then, after serving as NJDEP Commissioner and for a brief, very brief stint as Governor Corzine's Chief of Staff, President Obama had the audacity to lure Lisa from New Jersey to Washington, where she led on climate nationally as administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And now, Lisa leads on climate in the business community through her perch at Apple, where she is Apple's Vice President of Environment, Policy, and Social Initiatives. Lisa holds a master's degree in chemical engineering from Princeton University and a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Tulane University. We are extremely delighted to welcome Lisa back to New Jersey virtually, and I invite her now to provide us with some opening thoughts on the business of climate change.
Hey, Marjorie, thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be back with my Jersey peeps.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thanks. Look, I am on the West Coast now, but New Jersey will always be near and dear to my heart. And I'm really excited to be reunited with my dear friend, Mark Mauriello as well. Between Marjorie and Jean Herb and Mark, I feel like we're back at the DEP for just a second today. Now, I joke that no matter where I go, I can always count on there being a few Jersey folks in the house. And that is true in California. And I think even if you don't see the Jersey folks, for me, Jersey's in our heart. Jersey is a proving ground. And as Marjorie said, after I left the NJDEP, I joined the EPA to lead it. I still think that the challenges within the state and also the solution making within the state rivaled those I dealt with at the federal level. And it's also true that I think the heart, the dedication, the knowledge of my peers in New Jersey rivaled any folks I met in Washington. So it's just always great to be back. Now I'm at Apple. I actually am in Cupertino today. This is my office. I don't have my mask on because I'm sitting in my office with the door closed, but I'm on the other side of the table, so to speak. I've been here about 7.5 years, and I lead our environmental initiatives. And then over time, I started to take on broader social impact work, and I lead our worldwide government affairs. And then most recently, I took on leadership of our racial equity and justice initiative. I think it's kind of cool that environment travels in the circle with these other social initiatives, like privacy, like racial equity and justice, like community education, like accessibility of technology for people with disabilities, because they're all about this idea that we need to use technology to improve the world around us. That said, I kept environment in my title. It's the first part of my title because that's where my heart is, and it's what I consider my life's work. At Apple, we've now made a very ambitious commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. That's 20 years ahead, of course, of what leading scientific bodies say every company in the world needs to do. We're already carbon neutral for our own corporate emissions. So what we're really talking about when we say carbon neutrality by 2030 is our scope 3 emissions, our supply chain. And I love that because hopefully you're all customers, but if you're not, we make a lot of hardware out in the world. So we're not talking about the easy job, the relatively easy job maybe of converting data centers, which a lot of folks have not done. But we're talking about working through a supply chain to bring manufacturing to carbon neutrality, to move them to renewable energy. And so I really love that. And we're also saying that, look, since our products are in the hands of our customers, we want part of our carbon neutrality by 2030 that all of our customers' emissions are neutral. And so we have to take responsibility to work around the world with governments and utilities to erase the carbon footprint of the charging that our customers do around the world. So that's really fun. It means we're busy in our manufacturing supply chain. We've been busy there since 2015. We already have 95 suppliers who are committed to using 100% renewable for Apple production, and that number continues to grow. Our goal is to transition all of that energy to 100% renewable by 2030, because we feel like if our supply chain can do it, that's a way to show that everyone can do it, and that manufacturing is not going to be impossible to switch over. But we also need to think about other things if we're going to look at our products, and that's the resources, the actual natural resources that go into making an iPhone or an iPad or a Mac. So 3 years ago, we announced that we want to one day make our products using only recycled and renewable materials in our products. Because we think progress here will have a huge impact on carbon neutrality as well. So we're working to transform our linear supply chain model into a circular model that aims to eliminate our reliance on mining new material. We already have 100% recycled tungsten and 100% recycled aluminum case for our new Apple Watch models. We have our new iPads, which contain 100% recycled aluminum and rare earth elements in the audio magnets and in the enclosure where the aluminum is. So it's that kind of work that is kind of scratches my engineering itch. We do it because we should, it's fun, but it's also the right thing to do. But we also know that it can't just be one company or organization or one NGO working. We talk with governments around the world, so that's my government affairs hat. We understand that Apple has potential to drive large-scale change in the world. So we are really proud of this work, but none of it matters if the communities most impacted by risk are not included in solutions to address that risk. And so if you know of my tenure at Njdep, which recently passed the state of New Jersey recently passed a wonderful environmental justice law, but when I was at EPA, environmental justice was top on my agenda. And of course, after yesterday, we saw that the Biden administration is bringing that to the fore in a whole new way yet again. So it's awesome to see. Here at Apple, we want to think about what the private sector can do on environmental justice. So we recently opened applications for what we're calling an impact accelerator. We're looking for Black and brown owned businesses that are in the clean energy or the circular economy space. We want to try to ensure that we can invest in those businesses and sectors like renewable energy and recycling that also put wealth into the hands of communities that for too long have just seen the bad part of climate change, but none of the jobs and wealth that renewable energy and other solutions can bring. That's part of our racial equity and justice initiative that I mentioned at the beginning, $100 million focused on efforts to address systemic inequality in education, economic equality, and criminal justice reform. And that was announced in June following the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. So as you can see, I'm really proud to do this slate of work. I'm grateful for my peers, but I'm also just really excited and proud of the time in the public sector, my 25 years in the public sector. So I'm really excited to be here. I can't wait to continue the conversation. Back to you, Marjorie.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for those opening thoughts. That was great, and we're so happy to have you. So Lisa is now going to be joined by a very special moderator, Mark Mauriello, who succeeded Lisa first as NJDEP's Assistant Commissioner for Land Use Management, and then again as NJDEP's Commissioner. And like Lisa, Mark has a distinguished career in public service where he served New Jersey for 30 years, beginning way back in 1980 as a shoreline mapping specialist with the New Jersey Geological Survey. I had to get that in there, Mark. As an expert on coastal zone management and floodplain management, Mark is well versed on the impacts of climate change. He's a participant in the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance in his current role as Director of Environmental Affairs for Edgewood Properties, M&M Realty Partners. And we're delighted to invite Mark now to continue our conversation with Lisa. Mark?
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that intro, Marjorie. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you today, Lisa. I think back of the stress that we endured at DEP.
Hey, Mark, could you turn your camera on, please?
Oh, that might help. There we go. There we go. Thank you, Matt. But I think about what we endured, the stressful environment of the DEP and the challenges we faced. But what I realized, we did a lot of great work, and the friendship that was formed through that process is really enduring, and I value that. And just it's great to be with you today. So enough with the mushy stuff, and we'll start on some questions. The first question I was going to ask you, it may be a little bit moot because you talked a lot about what Apple's approach to environmental sustainability is, but I'll give you a chance anyway if there's anything particularly in your mind that you're particularly proud of amongst the range of actions that the company is taking in that field.
Yeah, thanks. I just think, and you should comment on this too, Mark, I think leaving EPA, it was really important to me that to come somewhere where we could have huge impact, where the work you do actually ripples further than one company. And I felt like at Apple, the moment that we're in right now calls on us to be as aggressive as we can and as innovative as we can, because, that's actually what this whole company is known for, sort of changing everything with innovation, right? So this idea that every company should include in their carbon footprint the emissions of their customers is not new. I mean, people have been talking about that with respect to fossil fuel companies for a long, long time. But we thought we want to extend that into the technology sector as well. So we get to do fun things like go to governments around the world and say, hey, our customers can't access clean energy. Let us help you figure that out, because that's the way the world is going. And it's been sort of this wonderful cycle because governments are all looking at the same question, and they like the fact that a private sector company says, let me show you how to do this in a way that takes advantage of the fact that honestly, renewable energy is cheaper now than than fossil fuel-based infrastructure. So that's probably one of the coolest pieces. That and the work with the suppliers, I think is what I'm really proud of, because we're a hardware company, and so that's real meaningful work.
Right. Well, it gives you a chance to explain the ancillary benefits on cost savings, efficiency, jobs, all the other things that people worry about when you talk about sustainability. The opponents migrate right to the extreme with, oh, it's a job killing thing, or it's too costly. But it seems you have an opportunity to really explain the bigger picture, which is great. A question now that I have real interest in, because there are some parallels between your and my career, but you had your time at the EPA, you had your time at DEP in the enforcement world, and as serving as commissioner and then administrator, and now you're in the private sector. And I'm curious, given your public and private sector experience, how would you say your views may have changed in light of that experience?
Mm-hmm. It's really funny. I mean, I sit in meetings all the time where people will be like, "Oh, the regulators," and they kind of look at me and go, "Sorry, Lisa." And first off, I'm extraordinarily proud of the fact that we were regulators, and that we took the service of the work we did when we were all doing it really, as a trust. Like, we take this oath to protect public health and the environment, and we've seen time and time again what happens when people don't fulfill that oath, when they put other considerations first. And so the first thing I sort of carry with me is this fierce belief in the importance of public service, and especially in the environmental world, because whether it's New Jersey or the country, the state and federal environmental agencies are really the only people entrusted with protecting quality air and water, which we cannot thrive on, and communities cannot have economic growth if they don't have clean air and clean water. So I'm really proud of that work. When you come to the private sector, and I'm going to even say a little bit of the California thing. I mean, it's honestly the first time, don't tell my boss I said it, it's the first time I've ever had the ability to say, we have the resources to implement good ideas and innovations. Because the biggest thing with the public sector is you're spending public money. Budgets are what budgets are. We don't get to walk into the room and be like, you know what, give me more budget that often. And so, especially, you look at a time like now with the Biden administration, here it's been a real blessing that, first off, we have resources, and I have a boss, the CEO, Tim Cook, who says, you come to me with a good idea, you show me how it's good for the company, how it makes sense, let's try it. And we've tried a lot of things like that. I remember the first time I walked in and said, let's do a clean energy program in China. He didn't say yes right away, but we got there. Our work around forestry, our work on the circular economy. So I think what I would say is, you have a different pulpit, and businesses tend to listen to other businesses more than they listen to regulators. So, it's kind of a symbiotic relationship, at least as I see it. I mean, I don't know, maybe,
Right.
maybe you have some ideas too. But.
Yeah, it's interesting. In my personal experience, 30 years at DEP and now 10 in the private sector, I thought I knew a lot more about what it was like in the private sector than I ever did. And now I think, boy, if I had known some of this, 10 years in, 20 years in, it would have made me a little more effective, if for nothing else, being a little more sensitive to what's involved in getting things done on the outside world. So I kind of relish that. I don't pretend that there aren't things I wouldn't have done differently. That's for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting, because I always get asked by especially students, do you wish you had started in the private sector and moved to the public sector? But I actually think the way we did it is awesome. We were in the public sector, and it would have been great to figure out ways to know more. So that's a really interesting question. But I like the way we did it. I really do.
Yeah. Well, let's explore that a little bit more. We have, the President Biden nominated Michael Regan to head up the US EPA. similar background, in state environmental protection. We have a new acting commissioner here in New Jersey that joined the climate group last week in a webinar. So given the experience and hindsight, which we all love to point to, are there some advice or some thoughts that if you could express to these newly appointed professionals that in terms of climate change, and are there things that pitfalls or things you might suggest, watch out for this or pay more attention to that?
That's so interesting. Look, I actually think in this moment, what's really important is to restore public trust in the system at large, or to at least work to not have it further erode. There's just been an erosion in what government can do compared to the private sector. And I personally don't think, it's not a zero-sum game. You want a strong private sector that's pushing progressive ideas forward, like we do here at Apple, but you also want a strong government, because you and I both know there will always be laggards. There will always be people who will say, that's nice that you're out here. I'm going down here somewhere and make as much money as I can. And the people who suffer when that happens are poor communities, communities of color, because that is the heart of environmental injustice, environmental racism, whatever we want to say. And I think that's really important to do. So look, if you work in a regulatory agency, regulate. That is actually your job, and that is not a bad word. I know every cycle, political cycles, people try to come in and act like regulation is a bad thing. But regulation sets the table and protects people's health. It's like the bare minimum. And then allow leadership companies to do what they should be doing, which is setting the bar way out in front. And as you know, what happens in the competitive marketplace is other folks are like, well, I want what they're doing because it's making them money. And we're starting to see even some of that in the financial market. So for me, that's why I think it's best to go public sector to private, because if you're a regulator, you regulate. And especially, standard setting, enforcement, which is where I kind of cut my teeth at DEP, and then environmental justice programs, which is going to be a huge opportunity and also a huge, ball of yarn to unpack in a state as densely populated as New Jersey. Those are all incredibly important programs. I think about the Highlands program. I think about the Pinelands. If somebody's not regulating all that, you end up with a very different state and a very different set of communities.
Right, yeah. And I think the advantage we had is starting in the public sector and understanding the statutory authority that drives a lot of what we did, at least in the regulatory program. So whether it's an air or land use or water, just something as simple as understanding, being able to articulate to the regulated community, to property owners and businesses, why do we regulate you? What's the intent? What's the purpose? And the more you can articulate it, these entities don't necessarily, they're not happy to hear it, but at least they understand why you're there and why you're doing what you're doing. And you're not just out on some, personal, trip to make their life miserable. So I tend to agree with that.
Yeah, and you did such a good job of that, Mark. I mean, I still think the one thing I think we all learn is you got to pick your battles a little bit. I mean, if I can shake my head at every backyard somewhere where we were arguing over, whether there was a wetland or not. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't important cases, but the ones that get pulled up by the, folks who want to make government look bad are the ones we always, as leaders and managers, if you're leading or managing a program, you got to be sensitive to, because to the outside world, it's like you scratch your head,
Right. A lot of cringing going on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's shift. I wanted to ask you, President Biden this week recommitted to the Paris Agreement, which a lot of us expected and were hoping, and kind of recovering our position in the world. And from your experience, both in government and business, and you touched on a little bit in our prior question, but can you reflect on the role that government as well as business plays in this agreement, in the context of the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, look, we're already being approached about what, not just us, but hey, leadership companies step up even more. And that's a good thing. I think there's a couple of things to realize on Paris and just climate in general. Kudos to, I'll call it my kids' generation. This moment, this election, I actually think this, political moment is being driven by students, being driven by folks who sort of like in the 70s and the late 60s before there was an EPA, but there was a DEP, I think. But, all of a sudden are saying, look, thanks for all the help, y'all, but we got it from here. And I'm actually psyched to see Michael Regan at EPA. I'm psyched to see the young leadership that's coming in, because I think that is the key to progress going forward, that you have this impatient, but really smart, very intersectional group of people. They grew up in a world where everything's connected. There's no silos. They can connect to anybody at any time, share ideas. So I think having and bringing that talent forward, and if you're still in a leadership position, mentoring them so that they're the most effective they can be, without taking away, their passion and enthusiasm, really important. So I think the most important thing that business can do is to do like what we're doing here at Apple. Say, look, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. We're going to get out of the way and buy whatever headroom we can by taking care of not just our emissions, but our customers and our supply chain. And then innovate. Businesses come up with innovative solutions to problems because it makes them money. That's a really important thing. We do still need to continue to innovate, not only on clean energy, but on storage, energy transmission. Governments need to invest in transmission. We have lots of places with renewable resource and energy and can't get it to where the loads are. That's still a concern. And then materials and resource improvements as well.
Yeah. Well, I want to shift, so this is an important question. I want to make sure we can cover it in the time we have left. But this past year, we've seen a light on intersection of systemic racism, health inequities, and the climate crisis kind of together. Now, what role has or can the business community have in addressing issues within communities that are most affected by these inequities?
Yeah, look, I think the business community in general, and frankly, the sector I'm in, has been spending a lot of time on thinking about inequities, even in terms of our workforce, right? I don't hire, I'm not in charge of human relations at Apple, thank goodness. But I think first and foremost, businesses have to make sure that they are offering opportunity so that they have diversity in their staff, women, people of color, because you cannot really be intersectional if you don't have diversity inside your organization. You don't have those connections. So there's work to do there first and foremost. Things like the Racial Equity and Justice Initiative. If you had ever asked me whether I'd be working on racial equity as opposed to environmental justice, I would probably, I kind of was hesitant to get engaged, but I think that businesses that have the resources to do so, especially on education, job training, job creation. A lot of what President Biden's talking about is the intersection between climate, renewable energy, and job growth. Let's move growth and sort of decouple it from this dependence on fossil fuels. That requires business leadership as much as it does government leadership. The government can send strong signals, even legislate or regulate, even eventually a price on carbon. All those things can happen, but business can go ahead to the point where, and you remember this, once business starts to comply, the regulatory part is easy. It's almost like you're coming behind them and just making sure to push the laggards along. That's the easiest the easiest thing to do. On environmental justice, it means that you really need to think about innovative ways, whether it's, we just signed up to support a new center in Atlanta to teach technology education, as well as hardware and software engineering to historically Black college and university students and assist professors. We just started an app development academy. We announced the first one in the US will be in Detroit. Businesses can go further and say, until we have equity in this country, we don't have America as great as it should be. And so I think, the work we're doing at Apple is starting to get to where businesses can be more responsible.
Yeah, no, that's great. You just mentioned the price on carbon, and it's been discussed for a long time. Interestingly, it's an area where there is surprising agreement across political lines in many cases. But what would you say about how you balance a price on carbon with how that price may ultimately be passed on to consumers who are already struggling economically, and communities that may have less of a tax base to absorb that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is, the devil is always, or the angel is always in the details, right?
Mm.
What happens to that money that's paid? Usually, there's, in the old days, it was cap and trade. I don't think anyone's talking about that much anymore. There's carbon taxes, there's tax and dividend. There's all these ideas about how the revenue that's raised, however it's raised, whenever it's raised, can be put back into the communities that will actually benefit from a jobs and a growth perspective. Right now, we need a process that reinforces that addressing climate change is actually, it adds to economic growth. It creates jobs, it creates opportunities, not the other way around. And I think that has been the rhetoric for so long. And it's so easy for folks to kind of retreat to, don't do anything because we might cost jobs, that we need programs, especially now when we're in the middle of the economic recession caused by the pandemic, that as you grow out of it, you make the smart investments. So I don't know that a price on carbon's coming anytime soon, but I think there's a ton that can be done in the investments that are made as a result of climate, right?
Yeah. Well, from quickly reading what's going on this week with President Biden and yesterday's executive order, and I love the way he's framing climate policy as jobs policy, because right from the heading, the banner, it reminds people that this is where he and many people think this can and should go. That don't play that game of, the minute you say climate, all of a sudden, jobs are adversely impacted and costs go up. So that was encouraging to see that. Looking at my tests, okay, I have Marjorie texting me on time, but I do have another, what will probably be the last question, given the time we have, and it's obviously relevant in that, we have this terrible pandemic that's changed the world in less than a year. How would you say it's affected your ability and that of other business leaders you may engage with to enact climate initiatives? And what type of adaptations may have been taken or have you taken to address the barriers to enacting climate initiatives?
Yeah, this pandemic has been, it shines a spotlight on inequity, first off. I happen to work in a field, a sector, as well as a company where we make the tools that allow what we're doing right now, virtual meetings, to happen, right? And so very mindful of the fact that if you're an essential worker, if you work in a hospital, or if you're in a grocery store, you don't have the luxury of what we're doing right this second. That being said, I think that puts a huge responsibility on us to then say, we can't slow down. That's why we announced our 2030 carbon neutral commitment last June. In the mid, hopefully in the midst of the pandemic, and we're coming out of it now. But that was our thinking. Like, we need to act differently, and we need to act urgently, and we need to, as an American company, because we see this a lot in Europe, but you see it much less here. use this as an opportunity to build back better. Not to necessarily quote the political slogan, but we're in a moment where we have to rethink a lot of things about our society. Why not use this moment to also build in sustainability, to also build in climate resilience, to also invest in the future instead of trying to limp along in the past. So that was the reason. And I think, I just think it also, to me, has really made you think a lot more about community, the community you live in. When you're connected and disconnected from it, all of a sudden it becomes really important again. And I've always said environmental protection comes down to the communities, the place you go home to, the place you go to school, the business you go to a little bit. People, I think, are suddenly aware again of how important it is for those places to be part of like who I am. And so I think there's a real moment to reconnect people into that moment.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, this has just been great. I know our time is up. Really want to thank you for taking the time to revisit your friends. We love you back here. You know that.
I miss Jersey. I miss the shore. Do you know how much a pizza costs in San Francisco? $30 for bad pizza. Come on.
Something wrong. Yeah. Well, the last question we didn't get to is, what do you most miss? And when I was thinking that, I said, Lisa's going to say something about pizza. She's going to maybe throw in giant tailgates and hanging out at Mompo up in Newark, the tapas.
Oh my God.
Strategizing on how to, fix the problems of the world. But Lisa, thank you so much. It's been a real thrill. I'm going to now turn it back to Marjorie to close us out. But thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you again to former DEP Commissioner Mark Mauriello for moderating such an insightful conversation, and a special thank you to you, Lisa, for being with us to share all of your and Apple's amazing work and to share your wisdom and inspiration with us today. For those of our listeners, this event's going to be posted on our website in the next day or so. And I'd like to invite all of you to join us on Thursday, February 4th. Our next event in this series is on advancing health equity in the era of the climate crisis, and we'll be featuring Surili Patel of the American Public Health Association. So again, you can find a link to the registration on our site and on our website. And again, thank you, Lisa. We miss you. And thank you, Mark. And this concludes today's event. Thank you.